Buying and selling in Texas is about to change, and one of the biggest lies being told about that right now is that home sellers won't be allowed to pay a buyer agent's commission anymore. That sellers will pay their agent and buyers will be paying their agents. End of story. Buyers, sellers will never pay your agents again. So, buyers everywhere are like, how in the heck am I gonna do that? My budget is $800,000. That could be like a $24,000 commission in addition to my other closing costs. Well, it's time to debunk that myth, and in order to do that, we're going to have to draw the distinction between the NAR settlement and a statement released by the DOJ, or Department of Justice, okay? Because these two documents are very different. And the problem we have with YouTube and social media is they're both being treated as fact. That 1 + 1 equals huge changes to the industry. And that is completely wrong, because one is a lawsuit and one is a published statement. Now, I do want to clarify here that this is not about my opinion of the NAR settlement or of the DOJ statement, okay? My goal here is accurate information to help you buy a home in Texas. That's it. Let's get into this by comparing three different sources: NAR, the DOJ, and the forms that the Texas Association of Realtors, or TAR, has provided to use with buyers and sellers. And keep in mind, I'm talking about Texas, not other states, not the country as a whole. If you're planning a move to Texas, you want to know how home buying is working in Texas. So let's tackle this head on. The NAR settlement reads, practice changes in paragraph 58 of this settlement agreement shall not prevent offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives off of the multiple listing service. So straight from the NAR settlement, offers of compensation are still a-okay. So what does the DOJ have to say about that? Well, they had some pretty strong feelings. In their statement of interest on February 15th, they wrote, as long as sellers can make buyer broker commission offers, they will continue to offer customary commissions out of fear that buyer brokers will direct buyers away from listings with lower commissions. Their recommendation? Well, they wrote the court should deny preliminary approval. Okay, so did that happen? Well, on April 24th, CNN reported a federal judge gave a green light to the National Association of Realtors settlement, paving the way for an overhaul. The DOJ recommended against preliminary approval. The judge granted it. So if you're keeping track, can sellers pay the buyer broker's commission? According to NAR, the answer is yes. According to the DOJ, the answer is no. But how about the TAR, right? The Texas Association of Realtors. Well, in their residential buyer tenant representation form in paragraph 7B about the source of compensation, the form reads, broker will seek to obtain payment of the fees specified in paragraph 7A, first from the seller, landlord, or their agents. If such persons refuse or fail to pay broker the amount specified, client will pay broker the amount specified less any amounts broker receives from such persons. So in Texas, can sellers pay the buyer agent's commission? Yes. You can glean here that TAR is not giving the high five to the DOJ's statement, but they are complying with the NAR settlement. And this is what we're seeing, okay? The TAR is complying with NAR. Their promulgated forms are allowing for the sellers to continue paying the buyer agent's commission. I recently had someone reach out to me on YouTube asking, Wendy, how will real estate change now that the seller is not allowed to pay the buyer's commission? And what he was referring to there, and you may have heard this elsewhere, is that concept of decoupling. The DOJ would like to see sellers paying the seller's agent and buyers paying the buyer's agent. Now, the NAR settlement doesn't require decoupling, and Texas isn't embracing it either. So we know sellers can choose to pay the buyer's agent, all right? That hasn't changed. But there definitely is change that you need to be aware of, starting with the NAR requirement for the representation agreement. The NAR settlement paragraph 58 Section 6 explains that unless inconsistent with state or federal law, this settlement agreement requires that all realtor MLS participants working with a buyer enter into a written agreement before the buyer tours any home. So basically, as a buyer, you will need to sign a buyer representation agreement before touring a home. So that is a change. It surprises me how many buyers I speak with who in the past have never used a representation agreement. Like, we've always used one. Now, that being said, moving forward, an agreement will be required. On top of that, all right, they also added some required specifications. First of all, to the extent that such a realtor or participant will receive compensation from any source, the agreement must specify and conspicuously disclose the amount or rate of compensation it will receive, or how this amount will be determined. And then B, the amount of compensation reflected must be objectively ascertainable and may not be open-ended, right? It can't say buyer broker compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering the buyer. So we know you'll need to have a buyer representation agreement if you'd like to use a buyer's agent, and that agent needs to be paid. We also know there is no requirement that you as the buyer must pay that agent. So let me say that one more time. In Texas, there is no requirement that you as the buyer must pay the agent, but you do have to agree that the buyer's agent will be paid. Now, we've spoken with buyers who've been like, Wendy, you know what, we're completely okay paying you out of pocket. Your services are worth it. All right, but let's just say as a buyer, you're either unable or you'd rather not pay your agent, right? You'd like the seller to pay that commission. Well, that is perfectly doable. First up, as your agent, we have to find out if the seller has already agreed to pay the listing agent and verify that that amount includes paying the buyer's agent. Okay, now an example of this would be, you know, if they're paying the listing agent, let's just say 6%, and they've told the listing agent to split that with the buyer's agent, okay? The payment would be called broker to broker. And by the way, please don't be confused when I use the term broker. Basically, that's how an agent gets paid, okay? They get paid at the broker level. So this is super easy. Problem solved. The answer is yes. Your buyer's agent is being paid. There's no guesswork here. On the 1-to-4 residential contract, it reads, pursuant to a previous separate agreement, listing broker has agreed to pay other broker a fee. Now, pulling all of this together, you have a compensation agreement between brokers and the addendum regarding broker fees. The Texas Association of Realtors, right, TAR, has given us the forms we need, okay, to continue facilitating the process of the seller paying the seller's agent and the seller's agent paying the buyer's agent. This process of co-broker fees has been the norm in Texas, and right now we're not really seeing that change, okay, because let me tell you, homes are sitting on the market longer, and sellers don't want to do anything that would limit a buyer from buying their home. So with co-broker fees, we're going to be able to easily find this information, but it won't be on the MLS any longer. All right, the NAR settlement specifically says that it can't be. That being said, those fees can be on the individual brokers' websites. Brokers can advertise them. If they're not on an agent's website though, any buyer's agent can also text the seller's agent to ask, and they'll be able to tell you, right? Their commission and the fact that it's split with the buyer's agent is baked right into their listing agreement. I mean, it has long since been negotiated. This is where everything you're hearing about big brokerages like eXp come into play. For example, Inman reports eXp Realty released a listing agreement specifying that it does not share commissions with a buyer's broker. Holly Mayberry, Senior Vice President of Brokerage Operations at eXp, told Inman the brokerage was not going to do broker-to-broker compensation. Now, that may seem very unsettling to you, and it probably led many buyers to think that they were going to have to pay their own realtor, but you have to understand what they are and aren't saying here. All right, now what eXp is saying here is that the seller can't pay the buyer's agent in this way. They're not saying that the seller can't pay the buyer's agent. They're simply saying, don't do it this way. All right, so how can they pay? Well, another way the seller can pay is by agreeing to pay the buyer's agent directly. All right, we would call this seller to buyer's broker. Remember before we had broker to broker as an option. Well, now we have seller to buyer's broker as an option. This is how eXp realtors are being told to handle compensation. So if you see YouTube videos claiming eXp won't let sellers pay buyer agents commissions, that's wrong, okay? They're simply saying, we don't want you to do it this way, do it this other way instead. In fact, you know what? Let's not even call it a commission, let's call it a concession. Now, I want to give you some ways this idea of seller to buyer's broker can happen. The first one is when the seller's a builder. Right? If you know you are strictly new construction, you're not even going to consider pre-owned, it is easy to eliminate the variable of who will pay your agent. Simply call the builders you're considering and ask them how much they pay a buyer's agent. If you've narrowed down the builders you're considering and they all say 3%, you can have a lot of confidence putting that in your representation agreement. I mean, one builder might have 100 homes for you to choose from, and you can know every one of those will pay your agent that commission. Now, I suppose it's possible, builders could change that pattern, all right? But the way things are in Texas right now, right, they offer a set commission across the board on their homes. So we would call this builder to buyer's broker, right? Because the seller is the builder. So yes, they are paying, and we would call it amount disclosed because they're telling you up front exactly how much it will be. Another way is when we have an individual seller, and that seller might say, I'm going to pay the same amount to any buyer's agent, and this is how much I'm gonna pay. This would be seller to buyer's broker. The amount's disclosed, and the answer is yes. This is 3 times now that we're gonna be able to find out whether a seller will pay the buyer agent's commission and how much they'll pay. And keep in mind, this is before you've viewed a single house. So there's no mystery here, there's no variable, right? So we have 3 different situations where as a buyer, you can view a home knowing, hey, I know the seller is going to pay my agent's commission. Another probably obvious option with the seller is they may flat out say no. In this situation, we will reach out to the listing agent and they tell us the seller's not willing to pay the agent under anything, under any circumstances. Hard no, they are absolutely not paying. But the thing is, you can still know in advance. You can know with that house that if you choose to consider it, it'll cost you an additional $10,000, $15,000, whatever's on your representation agreement in closing costs. So we would call this, again, seller to buyer's broker, hard no. So we now have 4 ways you as a buyer can know before ever viewing a home if the seller is willing to pay the buyer agent's commission. Okay, another way the seller can pay the buyer's agent directly is maybe they'll say, I want to answer how much or if I'll pay a buyer's agent with each offer on a case-by-case basis. With this type of commission, we're not going to be able to easily find this information. If we ask the listing agent, hey, is the seller paying the buyer agent's commission? The way they're going to reply, right, is they're gonna say, put it in the offer and we'll see what the seller says. What you have to be aware of in this situation is that the seller is focused on a form called the seller's estimated net proceeds, okay, or SENT. To the left will be expenses the seller pays, and then on the right side will spell out his profit. At the end of the day, seller cares about 2 things: how big that check's gonna be, right? And how minimal is the risk that the sale will close. He wants the biggest profit with the smallest risk. With a seller like this, the commission is just headed in, all right? It's gonna go right in with all the other expenses, and he'll decide whether or not he'll pay the buyer agent's commission. So when placing an offer as a buyer, particularly when they are not letting you know up front, you have to consider what you're asking the seller to pay as a whole, and of course, what their level of risk is. Now, risk is determined by multiple things, okay? It could think about things like appraised value or whether or not the buyer is pre-approved for a loan. Also, how long is the option period, right? A seller wants as little time as possible that the buyer can opt out of the contract. We would call this type of setup seller to broker, and we would call it a maybe, right? Maybe they'll pay the buyer agent's commission. And this approach is most in keeping with what the DOJ would like to see, keeping it fluid, and negotiated on a case-by-case basis. And again, I am not saying what is the right or wrong approach here. My objective is just to tell you options for buyers in Texas. With 4 of them, you can know before you ever view the home whether the seller will pay the buyer's agent or not. And with 1 of them, you don't know. Coming back to where we started, why is all this relevant? Because you as the buyer don't have to pay the buyer's agent, but you do have to own that they will be paid. So 4 out of 5 ways before you even view a home, you already have that answer. You can know whether or not the seller will pay the buyer's agent. Now, one thing you want to remember is, okay, unless it's new construction, if you bypass the buyer's agent, chances are you'll still have to pay something. It'll be one of the ways I mentioned above, right? Because the listing agent is not going to do twice as much work without wanting some form of additional pay. It may be baked in through the broker-to-broker arrangement, in which event you'll never really think about it. Or the listing agent may tell you that you have to pay something for it. So what's the difference in whether you use a buyer's agent or not? If you're asking that question as a first-time buyer, I can understand that. If you're asking that question and you've bought a home before, that means you had a lousy agent. All right, you need to raise the bar. So what are your risks? Well, with new construction, you risk overpaying. You risk being in a high-pressured situation because sales consultants are very good at what they do. It's their job to create FOMO. I mean, you're going to hear things like how they just got, several homes under contract this weekend, or there's an incentive special that ends tonight. Remember, you'll often end up in a charged situation where you can't think clearly. And in that environment, all right, how do you even know what a home is worth? You also want someone who can spot predatory clauses in builders' contracts or unreasonable inspection restrictions. Now, when it comes to pre-owned homes, right? Sellers' agents may totally downplay foundation problems being just a normal thing in Texas, or any other condition issues for that matter. And you can still find yourself way overpaying without that market analysis. So once you're under contract, you'll find yourself without guidance in negotiating repairs. Like what actually needs to be repaired? What happens if you meet the option period deadline and still haven't negotiated an agreement? All right, lots of things to think about there when it comes to bypassing representation and working directly with the listing agent. So buying a home in Texas is changing, but the change does not include this idea that you and only you can pay your realtor. All right, we've really debunked that lie. There are still a whole lot of other lies about the NAR settlement. So many so that, in fact, I made a whole video about it that you can watch right here. In the meantime, Wendy out.